David approached me about The Green Knight, and he wanted to kind of get my mind on it pretty early in the editing process because he knew the titles were going to play a pretty big part of the movie. And in this film, they serve to introduce a new sequence in the film, to introduce a new chapter in the hero's story, but also just in a rhythmic way to kind of break up the film for the audience. My normal process is I just start to dig into research, typographic research, historical research, to see what I can find. In this case, you know, there are no fonts from the 14th century because the printing press wasn't invented until 1450. So I am looking at illuminated manuscripts, but I'm also looking at anything that is medieval related that has been published since. And I'm working from scans of old books where I'm literally kind of cutting up letters and putting them back together. This idea, which was his from the beginning, was that the titles would serve almost as a counterpoint to the film. He sort of allowed me to go off and explore a bunch of things, and within the parameters of it should feel like it belongs in this fantasy universe. So one of the options I showed him was a beautiful hardcover printing of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and it had this embossed gold title on it. And I literally just worked from a scan of the cover and removed the book texture and just presented that title. And the great thing about digging back into historical type research is that as long as you're working pre-1920, you can kind of like cut that stuff up and use it however you want to. It's totally public domain. The font that we initially settled upon is one I think designed in 1935. The idea was to treat the typeface very boldly, almost like a Godard way, like just sort of slam it very big on the screen. But we did work with color a little bit, and the colors were mostly pulled from the shots themselves. You know, there's a very dark blue sky in this shot. Maybe let's darken the title to make it fit in a little better. Maybe let's pull a little bit of that blue into it. We did experiment with using more saturated colors, but I think what we ended up doing was sort of pulling back on that and going with something a little more subtle. The film was totally finished, and I was really happy with the titles, and David was really happy with the titles and really happy with the film. And then the release was delayed because of the pandemic, and I think he took the extra time and the opportunity to go back in and, you know, kind of go back to some of the longer, more esoteric version of the scenes and just a weirder version of the movie. And so he called me up and was just basically like, look, I want to redo all the titles. It was just like, I want this movie to be weirder, and I want every chapter title to be a totally different experience. But because it's David and because he called and said, let's get weird, I was fully in. I was living in rural Massachusetts for most of the pandemic, and I was taking these long, meandering walks in the wilderness every morning. And then one day I was on one of my walks, and I walked by this beautiful giant stump with all of these rings in it, and I thought, what if the title was just scratched in this tree stump? This is the photo of the trunk. It's a pretty good trunk. David suggested that I try kind of making it look like the title was scratched or something. And so I had just gotten this eye pencil, so I was like doing a lot of experiments with handmade titles and hand-drawn things. So I was like kind of making type treatments on my computer and then bringing them into the iPad and then just tracing over them to do them by hand. So this is me trying out a bunch of different hand-scratched versions of the title treatment. This is the one that's in the film, and it's, you know, very rough, obviously, but it's intentionally so. The idea, I think, was just to have the title on black scratched out like that, and then the serendipitous tree stump came along. So I brought it into the computer and I overlaid it on top of this trunk and then, you know, put a few effects on it to try to make it look like it was actually had been scratched into it, and it was just very evocative and cool. And as soon as I showed that to David, he was like, that's it, that's the one. David's idea from the beginning was to break the title up into two. This was like part of the brief. It's like, you know, we're going to start with Sir Gawain and ... Then we're going to have these chapter titles throughout, and then the last thing you see is going to be the Green Knight. The title comes at the end. The idea to do several different fonts and cut between them of Sir Gawain and was literally just David, I think, liked a bunch of the options that I showed him at the beginning, and he just took 5 or 6 of them and made a little montage of them, and he showed it to me, and I was like, that's, it's brilliant. With the titles that are in the film now, I think there are a variety of textures and kind of interesting, edges to the type. I mean, a lot of that is just from the fact that some of the references I was pulling from and some of the scans of old books that I was sort of like repurposing for titles, the source material had texture baked into it. I'm looking at a book of alphabets, you're seeing the flaws, and it was a fun time to kind of dig in and try to make the coolest, weirdest version of the Green Knight titles that I could. This is basically when we started the Redux, when we kind of redid all the titles. This is the Photoshop file I had that I was working on, just a bunch of different options to show David for each title. So there's a lot of stuff. I think this is pretty close to what ended up in the film. But for each of these, there were multiple options. Part of Let's Get Weird, part of that new mantra that we had for this second round of the titles, was for me about just finding new placement for the title. It's not always directly in the center. The titles, are not just going to be a different font, they're going to be in a different place. Playing around with trying to see what it looked like if the words were sort of in different spaces on the road, kind of like putting them into the image itself. It meant like what feels right for this moment and what feels right on this shot. Like thinking about the shot and the title as being part of almost a magazine layout or a composition that works together, rather than the titles being a layer that goes on top of the shot. There is no way I would have reached the result that I did without his pushing me to get weirder, without his, his idea that we can just sort of like let the titles be whatever they are whenever they come up. I think my talent in this case was finding all of this cool typographic material to work with and then arranging it on the screen. But in terms of the vision for the titles and how they work in this film, David got me there. But as soon as he suggested it, I knew what he was going for. And I was really excited to kind of stretch my normal way of doing things to make something special for this film.